welcome to Therabites, where we bring you bite-sized episodes, each one a piece of the puzzle that helps to explain the therapy world, the research behind it all, and how it relates to families. My name is Dr. Dana Poole, physiotherapist and clinical lead at the Healthy Strides Foundation. It is my privilege to be hosting this podcast, one that is directed for families of children with neurodisabilities. We hope to be able to answer some of your questions through this format. To help us navigate our way through these big questions, we have the lovely, the one and only Kate co-hosting this podcast. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you so much for having me again. Hopefully this has been helpful for everyone listening.
It's so good to be back again. You've had some really good questions, Kate.
Oh, thank you.
I do like them. They're like thoughtful questions. You need to really think and dig deep on them, but those are often the questions you ask, right?
Yes, yes. And thank you to the families that are also bringing them to us.
Yeah, I love that.
Yes.
It's so good. So keep them coming because, we all have different experiences, and sometimes, most of the time, it's not you experience it on your own, right?
Yes, every time someone has a question, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, we've had that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think you have another great question for me today, but before you get into it, I do need to always interrupt this so we have something random research that comes out. Like I keep saying, I do find it bizarre that some of this research gets funded. But, I guess they're important in the grand scheme of things. And this one in particular, I'm glad has gotten funded.
Oh, I'm excited.
Did you know that African elephants can address one another by name?
Oh, that is so cute.
Isn't it? So these researchers have recently published their findings in Nature Ecology and Evolution, that's a journal, and they found that wild African elephants actually communicate with individually specific calls like human names.
That's incredible.
So when they vocalize, and they've analyzed the rumble, how long it goes for, the pitch, it is specific to an actual elephant in their family.
That's absolutely incredible.
Isn't it?
Isn't the theory that elephants have brains the size of peanuts?
Oh,
just to throw a curveball.
Is that really true? But we'll have to look that one up because I feel like they've got big heads. They should have a bigger brain. They paint. They do all these amazing things. So look, my take home from this is that the Jungle Book really was based on a true story.
I love that.
Isn't it?
That's amazing.
They do talk to each other and I love it. And I think, well, for parents, this might be something that you can share in the car ride home when you're picking up your kids and go, hey, elephants are incredibly intelligent. There you go. They call each other by name. Anyway, that was not the reason why people tune into this podcast. They do tune in for a question by you. So what is your question today?
Okay. So this question is very topical in the winter season and it's something that gets discussed often amongst us caregivers to children with neurodisabilities and complex medical conditions.
Okay.
So a lot of the time it can be really clear when you need to call an ambulance or present to an ED, such as seizures, breathing issues, severe illness, dehydration. So there's a lot of really clear things, but then for our children, there's also a lot of grey area.
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of us, we might do our best to avoid hospitals, avoid unnecessary medical traumas.
Do I have to go back? Yeah.
Also avoid catching things, when we go to hospital, we usually leave with something new. And so I guess it'd be good to know some examples, if you have some examples of things that might come up for a child with a neurodisability where it might require a visit to an ED or an ambulance ride.
Okay. This is a big one. And I think actually once I sort of answer the things that I know well, I think I'm going to throw this back to you, Kate, because as someone who probably does call the ambulance, has to go to ED, you probably have a lot to share.
Sure.
So I think I want to ask you the question. So look, to start off with, I think it's always really important to note that in the grand scheme of things, if you're worried and your child is not well, we kind of spoke about it a little bit in last week's episode. When you know that something isn't quite right with your child, the best thing to do is to call an ambulance, particularly like you sort of outlined there, if your child has complex medical, so whether that be seizures, whether that be respiratory issues, there's a whole host of things that can be worrying and be quite worrying quite quickly.
Yes.
And the reason why I would call an ambulance over driving there yourself is often because of the risk that driving often has. Because on the way there, most of us probably live 20, 30 minutes away from the hospital.
Yep.
That means 20 to 30 minutes where you're not able to observe your child. Like if you're by yourself and you're driving by yourself, never do that, because if your child is, if you're worried, like, you're definitely worried at this point, you can't monitor your child's progress. You don't want them to...
Or you can, but you can't drive safely while you're doing it.
That's right. Yep. That's right. Then you've got to pull over to the side, and then, then you're on your own. So there's definitely circumstances where you would definitely preferably make sure that you've got an ambulance that comes that can administer first aid all the way through to the hospital. And that's something that we should never shy away from. And this is why it's so important, for example, to have things like seizure management plans, to know what the line is. Sometimes, particularly if you're going to therapy or you're going to school, daycares, it's so important that they all know what your seizure management plan is.
Yes.
Because, if your child has a seizure and you're kind of like, oh, no, that one's okay.
Yeah.
Like, how do they know? Like, if they have a seizure for, 5 minutes, it depends for each child.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Then there is a protocol that is put in place straight away. Everyone's really clear. Everyone then knows to call the ambulance, and off they go to get the right help that they need.
Yeah.
So seizure management plans are so important in those circumstances. And my recommendation is to make sure everyone who is with your child, whether it be a support worker or any of the educational place they go to or therapy, have that. Or family, absolutely. So they know exactly what they need to do. So that's really important. Your experience, you've had to call the ambulance a few times?
We've had to do it many, many times.
Okay.
And I think the first time was quite scary because I hadn't had to do it before. And there's just this stigma where, I see ambulances as for car crashes and things like that.
Big traumatic things that happened.
And, you know, we were having a seizure and, it was a bad seizure, but it wasn't in that moment immediately life-threatening to me.
Sure.
But I knew that things can progress quite quickly. And it was our first big seizure, so we called the ambulance. And then I had a really great consultation with our neurologist while we were in hospital that time. And I remember saying, it was a bit scary having to call the ambulance. And he put my mind at ease and said to me, basically, anytime anything's wrong, even if it hasn't escalated to a seizure yet, so it could be anything that's wrong that you feel off about, call an ambulance because children can go downhill very much like what you said. They can go downhill so quickly and you might think you've got that 30 minutes to get them in the car, get them here, but why would you take that risk? And he sort of gave me permission almost. It felt like I needed that.
Yes.
And it also gave me something that I guess if I felt silly, which is so silly even to say that, but if, an ambulance came and I felt silly going, this is why I've called you guys, I could then say our specialist has said for us to call an ambulance in these situations, and that's what I've done. And of course, they've always gone, of course you would call us. Like, no one's ever made me feel silly about it.
Yeah, of course.
But that was, I think, really important for me to hear. And I'm so glad that he thought to say that. And so that, I think that was really good for us. And so then we've called an ambulance for all sorts of things, like even just sicknesses where he's just deteriorated quite quickly. We've had to call an ambulance for severe dehydration where it's sort of been, is it there? And then we've realised, if he's sick enough that it's caused dehydration, there is a chance that we are going to have a big seizure, and I'm not taking that risk.
Yes, that's
especially,
right.
The kids in the 5-point harnesses, having to rip them out of a harness, all these things you have to consider. If you've ever had a seizure in a car, then you know exactly how that feels to have to then find somewhere to pull over.
And that's
all
dangerous.
Of those.
That's a dangerous scenario to be in, right? Because it's emotional, it's so scary. And the adrenaline will be pumping as well.
Definitely.
So I think it's so important. And I love how you've highlighted that. There's just situations where you shouldn't hesitate. And sometimes you need to be given that permission. And I think that's adequate permission, right? To know. And I would say the thing is, if you do have a child that has, a complex medical history, one thing that you can do to get ready for that is to actually just sort of prep what your plan would be. Seizure management plan is quite obvious because most children who do have seizures do come with a management plan.
Yes.
If they don't, ask for one and make sure everyone has a copy of that. Update everyone, make sure it's there. But if there's things like respiratory and oxygen saturation, if there's things that you know that can change quite quickly, just have an associated plan that everyone has ready to go, because in that moment, you're not going to have time to think about that. It will just be like, A, B, C, you've seen all these things happen. It becomes a no-brainer, not an emotional decision. It just becomes a no-brainer. Call the ambulance. Let's go. Let's do it right now.
One thing that we have found really helpful that we do now is we always carry a medical kit with all the medications for all sorts of things that can happen. And I always update it when we receive in the mail his recent discharge paperwork from an ED.
Yes.
Because it just has all the info. So then when if you've been in an ambulance before, you know that they like to run through everything. And so now if I'm busy attending to my child, I just hand over the paperwork and they're like, oh, this has everything I need outside of the immediate, clinical information that they require.
So good.
Yeah, and so that's a big help.
Because most of the time when you go to ED, depending on where you go, well, actually, it doesn't matter. You'll probably get someone different on the other end anyway, right? So you don't have the time or the headspace to explain everything. So I love that you've done that, and that's such a smart thing to do. I know many families do that, and it's just worth taking the time to do it and getting those notes. And so if you haven't been to ED before, it might be the doctor you see that has the recent letter, it's got their diagnosis, current medications, even the dosage related to it, because that's the stuff that you might not remember.
Oh, I have blanked so many times when they say, what anti-epileptics are you using or something like that? And I go, that one, it begins with that. And they're like, no, I don't know.
I know. It's a whole new language, really, isn't it? Yeah. So having that ready to go is important. And it kind of goes back to our conversation last week about intuition. Parent intuition is so valuable, and to trust yourself when that does happen and to make sure you hand over that information to whoever is on the other side, whether it's the ambulance or whether it's the ED doctor. But things that might have changed as well. So things like, I noticed a new bruise, or there's new people at the school at the moment, new support workers, just different changes in their environment that could escalate things too. Like they might sound really simple, but put all together, life of a child that has so many things happening, who knows what the impact that can have. So just value that information still. Like, do you have any information that you always want to make sure you want to bring?
Yes, so we have learned, and this was something that you helped us with a couple of years ago, to always have an up-to-date height and weight. So we have it on our calendar that we do it once a fortnight on a Sunday, and then we write it up on the calendar or put it in our phone, so then that way we can easily take a photo of the calendar or have it in our phone at the ready.
And the reason for that often is growth spurts can change things when it comes to medications or pain or tone, things like that.
Most definitely. Yep. That, I think I said it in the last one, but we always try and have updated video footage of what a typical healthy, happy child looks like, so that we can always reference that if we need to, depending on what we're there for. And I think the other biggest thing that I've learned is back yourself. So I used to go into it a bit timid and I'm not sure if this is important, but this, and sort of would put it like that. And now I go, I think it's really important that you know this. And I think it's really important that you look into this.
That's really good
because
language.
This has been a historical thing that we've experienced or that has been overlooked before. And I, try and reference things that have been overlooked before that have actually contributed to something. And that has definitely helped us be seen quicker or had the right people come in sooner, whatever that looks like. So
again, that information is so valuable, isn't it?
Yes. So definitely being able to explain what a worst case scenario looks like from a health perspective, even though you're not in it in that immediate moment, does help people understand that bigger picture of what they could potentially be looking at.
It's so important. Good advice, Kate. And the last bit of advice I want to ask you, because this is always important. If you have called an ambulance before, it does come at a cost, which I don't think is often spoken about. Not that I want this to be a reason why you don't call an ambulance. Like, always call an ambulance when it is a medical emergency. But it is worthwhile knowing that there is a cost involved. What's your experience with that?
Yeah, we were pretty blown away when we got our first ambulance bill. Thankfully, given that we had a medically complex child, we do have ambulance cover in our private health.
Okay. So it's worth looking into making sure you have that.
It's worth looking into that. And I know that there are other options depending on where you live. There are other things outside of private health that you can look into.
Yep.
So that's really good to know as well, that if that's not in the budget at the time, I know
if you don't have private health.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
It's worth talking to St. John about that as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think that's often not really spoken about, is it?
No.
And it's all quite traumatic anyway. And I think making sure we keep that as part of the conversation and being prepared when you can, when you've got the headspace to think about these things, right?
Exactly.
It's just to make sure we contact them. So contact St. John is what you would recommend.
I would definitely contact private health first. So I know that when we were looking into it, it can be from as little as $64 a year to have that just the ambulance only cover on an individual.
Right.
But again, that will change based on family circumstances.
Sure. Okay.
So, yeah, it's not always a hefty cost to have that cover in place.
That's good to know.
Very good to know.
Really good to know. That's great advice. Oh, I feel like I asked you more questions in this one, Kate. That was really useful.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And I hope that was really helpful for all the families out there as well. If you're ever wondering, this is always a topic that does come up quite frequently.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks for asking the question and for answering all of my questions. And to all the families, we'll pop some links of this in our blog as well. So stay tuned. Make sure you have a look and there'll be more information there for you. But we'll talk to you all again next time.
Thank you. Bye.